Okay, you might want to leave. This is the same talk. Next up, what am I going to cover? If this looks like stuff that you already know, you also may wish to leave, because otherwise you just get to deal with my sense of humor for the next hour, and I'm pretty sure Jason Scott's sense of humor is a better one, and he's in the next room talking about podcasts. If you know what ISO is, if you know what aperture is, if you know what shutter speed is, if you understand what the term focal length means, if you know how to use a flash, or you know how to frame a subject, that you will learn nothing from this experience, and you will leave a hollow shell wondering what this talk was about. On the other hand, if you'd like to hear me yammer about these, here we go. Okay, camera basics. Last year I had a number of bullet points. This time I have a block diagram. This is to get you on the same page so you understand what your camera is actually doing underneath all of that beautiful, shiny metal and plastic that you point at, you look at the back of the screen and go click. The environment has light being emitted off of it. Better statement, reflected off of it somehow. That light is going through free space, or air as the case may be, into the front of a lens, which then focuses it onto an imaging plane. That would be the thing on the left side. As I gesture to the left, and you guys know that's the left. Stage left side. This is important. Understanding what's going on here will make the rest of this particular talk a lot easier. I will be coming back to this diagram. Next up, ISO. How many have heard of the dreaded term ISO? How many understand exactly what it's telling you? Yeah, okay, great. We have the right audience, excellent. ISO is a measurement of how sensitive an imaging surface, be it film, be it digital, be it CMOS, be it TTL, be it some magical device not yet invented, how sensitive it is to light. You double the ISO number, you get double the sensitivity off of the surface. Downside. In modern, unmodern, old, new, this is probably a law of physics, I just don't know which one it is. You make something more sensitive to light, it also gets more noise. So the final effect of that is, as you make a sensor that's extremely sensitive, it's also extremely noisy to the point where you can't actually see anything in it. We'll get to that. ISO is not, however, a measurement of noise. Keep that in mind. If ISO were a measurement of noise, you could sit there and actually tell how noisy a camera was based off of its ISO number. Can't. You can be pretty certain that ISO 200 on this camera, which is what I've been wandering around in blinding roomfuls of people all at once, all-con, you can be reasonably sure that 200 is more noisy than 100. That's pretty consistent. I'm sure some laws of physics have to be broken to make it other than that. ISO 400 on camera B, you can be pretty sure is more noisy than ISO 200 on camera B. But you really don't know how noisy ISO 400 on camera B versus ISO 100 on camera A or vice versa. My camera on 400 will look better than just about any consumer-grade $200 camera on anything. Set it at 50, doesn't matter. Mine on 400 will probably look better. So key thing to keep in mind, ISO is the sensitivity, not noise. Higher sensitivity, higher noise, but comparing camera to camera, you can't tell anything. Direct comparison. And once again, it's very hard to see due to the fact that we're blowing this through an LCD projector whose primary job is to smooth out an image and make it more difficult to see the nasty jaggies that are in it. But the point of this is, on the left side, I have 100 on my camera. On the right side, I have 3200. And okay, you don't see the difference in the whites. You do see the difference in the green, where you'll see these little specks of noise popping up. I don't have anything red in that photo, but there's a red speck there. This gets really bad at higher and is entirely imaging sensor dependent.
Is there an official noise number?
No. So the recording got this. The question is there an official noise number? No. Have never found one that actually shows up and gives me a metric that I can measure. Yes?
However, as you go up in ISO, and it looks worse in some ways, it looks better in others.
Yes, occasionally you can actually see the subject. That's usually a big thing that most people want to see. So increased ISO is useful, and there are certain situations where increased ISO is entirely upside, and you don't care about the noise. Often, if you have a high enough resolution and you're willing to downscale the image in post-processing, which I'll mumble about later, a higher ISO doesn't matter because the noise is being averaged out over a number of pixels. If you're crazy like me and end up having to actually use the raw image sensor resolution, a higher ISO is a killer. It turns an otherwise beautiful image into crap. 99% of the time, you want to use the lowest ISO setting you can for the environment that you're shooting the photos in. 99% of the time. I'm sure there's 1% of the time that's not true. It happens. But I can't give you rules of thumb unless I'm willing to be general about those sorts of things. Typically, on your digital camera, ISO is going to land somewhere between 100 and 400 for automatic. If you want to take it outside of that range, you will probably have to grab some switch on your camera and tell it to go higher. If you're on a film camera, well, the ISO is whatever the ISO of the film you loaded is. That can range dramatically. Okay, next evil topic, which you've probably all heard of and sat there and scratched your head at some point. Aperture. There is an iris that sits on that block diagram that controls how much light gets through the lens. This allows you to control at some level the exposure, but more importantly, it ends up controlling the depth of field, which now makes me dive off in the left direction and explain what depth of field is. When you focus a camera on a subject, you're focusing on a given point away from the camera. It's a distance. That is the point where everything is in focus. There's an acceptable range on either side of that. So we're going to declare this to be the line, camera's over here. You focused on this point. There's an acceptable point where stuff is in focus around that range. Since you have that acceptable point in focus around that range, stuff sort of near the focus point looks okay. Depth of field is how wide that range is and can vary greatly. Demo photos of that. It's called the f-stop as well. It's called the f-stop because it's a fractional value. I don't understand the history of how it got set up this way. I didn't get into photography until far too late in the game, and taking pictures is more interesting to me right now than learning the history of why it got set up this way. So if you ask me why it's set up this way, I'm going to have to stand there and say, I have no idea. Useful things to know. It's the denominator of a fractional value. So an f1 lens says all the light gets through. An f1.8 lens means 1 over 1.8 of the light gets through. 3.5, 1 over 1.35, or excuse me, 1 over 3.5. This means as the f-stop goes up, less light is getting through. The effect of this, though, since less light is getting through, the depth of field gets wider. Okay, so this is my example target from last year. This is not actually a depth of field demonstration. This is just so you know what the next two pictures are actually of, because otherwise you sit there and going, what's the rusty bar? I set my camera on the front of this tractor and looked up at its steering column. And I sat there and ran the f-stop around. This is a photo off that camera at f3.5. In the background, it's fuzzy. In the foreground, it's really fuzzy. The one point in focus is the top of the steering column. That's it, f22. The entire thing gets sharper at both the background and the foreground. There's a much wider range over which you can see what's in focus.
Your camera's capable of that natively. You don't have to do a lens change to make that happen?
No, the aperture is a setting which would normally live as part of your lens. Though there are some camera designs where the aperture is not. Aperture is a setting that exists on all cameras. The one example that I can come up with where it might not exist would be cell phone cameras. I'm going to disbelieve that they exist and move on. So if I just flip back and forth, you can see the difference in what the aperture setting is doing. What I haven't got to, which I'm getting to, is this affected the other settings I had to make. Okay. So jargon, because every field is filled with jargon, and due to working in the computer industry too long, I seem to pick it up without thinking about it, but it helps to sometimes actually say what it is. When you have a lower minimum f-stop, you describe the lens as faster than one with a higher minimum f-stop. An f1.8 lens, which is minimum f-stop is f1.8, is faster than a lens that is a minimum f-stop of 3.5. This sort of terminology ends up happening a lot, particularly because film that has a higher ISO value, which you remember it makes it more sensitive to light, is described as faster than film with a lower ISO value. You have to know what they're talking about when you hear the term faster, because it doesn't actually, because it means something slightly different in each context of what people are talking about. So you saw the varying depth of field effect on the last two slides. Now I'm going to show you how you can use that to your advantage if you know it's going to happen. That's a rose. You can't see what's behind it because I wanted to draw your eye directly to the rose itself. Since I've very explicitly told the camera use a very low f-stop, the background got blurred out. Note, I was about this far away from it when I was shooting the picture. So the background gets blurred out because it's focusing very close. The depth of field was about that wide. Physically, depth of field, this was the only acceptable focus range. And the background was about that far away. Blurred out, you end up with a picture like that. If you look here, you can see it's actually already getting fuzzy at that point. That's how narrow the depth of field was for that photo.
When you say lower, you are looking at the same one point, whatever, instead of on the end of the range, right? Just keep terminology in place. You're saying you're using a lower f-stop to keep it close.
Lower f-stop is just a matter of, in the arbitrary sense of, yes, it's a low f-stop. The number is lower. This means that more light is getting through.
Just making sure that the jargon of the terminology.
Yes, it is really bizarre. And it doesn't necessarily make any sense, and I would have not built the terminology this way, but photography is now an old field, and you have to deal with the terminology as is. Okay, last major knob to twist on your camera, shutter speed. Yep, does exactly what it tells you. This is how long your shutter is open. This is how long light has to get to your imaging surface. It is typically described, except when going for extremely long exposures, as a fractional value, once again, in seconds. So a shutter speed is usually described as 1/60th of a second, or 1/500th of a second. I pick out 1/60th because it's a very useful number. It's really about as fast as, careful. It's about as slow of a shutter speed as you want to have if you're hand shooting photos. Typically, cameras won't go much below 1/30th on automatic. Okay, so short shutter speeds can create stop motion images. We can freeze reality for a mere moment and take a picture of it. And since every manual on the planet regarding photography does this, here's mine. Fountains are this wonderful thing that you can stop motion of, and they blur out beautifully, and yeah. The one on the left, long,